Good morning. It is exactly 9 o'clock, and so congratulations to everybody who's here on time. And if each of you can help one other person to come on time, we'll all be on time next week. Now, first of all, you have the reader. Were you able to do some of the reading? And how was the reading?
First reading was, I couldn't do because
the first one was a little bit problematic. And the second one, were you able to do the second one? The J. Haley one? Okay, all the other, that's an article from 1936, and it was hard to get a decent copy. That's the only copy that I had. So, today what we're going to do is to go through what I started to explain last time and apply it twice. And then the exercise, we're going to apply it one more time. And then we will assume that it's become somewhat familiar to you and we'll be able to use it in the future. If you recall, the main thing that we started to talk about last time was that there's no way to come in quietly. Okay. The one thing we talked about last week was the fact that human beings are not simple. In other words, if you're thinking about yourself as therapists and somebody brings up a feeling or a thought, perhaps a dream, and you feel that what you need to do as a therapist is to say, well, I'll tell you what that means. This is what it means. Then you know you're making a mistake, because nothing ever means one thing. And what we're trying to do is to take something that's amorphous, give it some sense of clarity, not complete clarity. And I think probably all of you have been through a second degree, so you know that the ability that human beings have to think and to categorize and to put into language is limited. We can use language to get to some aspects of reality, but not all aspects of reality. So we never try to complete our understandings. We never try to complete our interpretations. What we try to do is to do something with some part of the interpretation that makes things start to move. What does it mean to start to move? People who come to us usually are stalled. There's something that's going around in circles. We'll talk about that more in a minute. There's something that isn't moving ahead. And when we say, well, this is one meaning that might be useful for us, and that's as good as it gets. You're not going to get to this is the meaning. You're going to get to this is one meaning that if we use language and we share it together, it might be helpful to get things to move. That's what we do in therapy. We don't do the movement, and we don't solve the solutions. We get the person to start to move where they weren't able to move. And we watch and see if they start to move. And if they start to move, we stop doing the work for them and we let them start to move, because they're going to go the right way and we might take it the wrong way. So one way of looking at it is that we want to put wheels under something, right? That something has come to a stall, something has stopped moving, and we're looking for a wheel to put somewhere, but not everywhere. It's not useful for us as therapists to try to have the correct, absolute, and exhaustive truth, because human beings don't have that. But we can have one additional truth. We can see one additional meaning that can help somebody to start to move with that meaning, and that will make it possible to see the other pieces of the puzzle as well. Okay, that's clear. We're going from very high aspirations to very limited aspirations. And that's what Freud did. We started with Freud. That's what Freud did. Freud was a blabbermouth. He usually talked too much. If you read his cases, you'll see that he was partly sort of giving a lecture instead of interpreting. But most of the time, he would say, this could be that. This might be that. And that was enough. That was enough. That was something that wasn't there before, that's now there. So when we're doing the whole map of what could be there, we're not aspiring clinically to get the whole map correct, especially since we're not doing psychoanalysis here. We want to see what's in the map to think of an additional way that might be useful. If we could put wheels under it, somebody can start to think about it. So this is the map. Now that we've said what the map is not, now let's take a look at the map We started to talk about the fact that human beings have things that drive them, that they don't understand, they don't experience it. We don't experience it as me. I experience something that's pushing me. I don't identify with it. And I have an attitude towards that, like, why should I have that feeling, or why should I have that thought, and so forth. So there's a balance between what is driving me, pleasure, something perhaps erotic, something that I say, I don't know where that's coming from, but it's there, and how I deal with it. So that's the first line of our map. The second line of the map, where we got a little bit involved in language, is, if you want to put it simply, the attitude of the conscience, not conscious, conscience. Conscience is the voice of no, that's not good. And so human beings, when they are doing something, they also are watching themselves from the outside and judging. Is it good, right? And let's say that I'm doing something, and I'm looking at it and saying, this is not good. It's me that's looking at it and saying it's not good. And then the force that says it's not good is usually a little less developed than the full personality. And so it wants to punish things in a very severe way. And then I say to myself, I talk to that part of myself, that set of functions of myself. Remember, we're not talking about little animals inside the human personality, we're talking about functions that tend to run together. So I look at that function and say, we could do a little differently. Now, do I do that consciously? No. Let's say, put it this way, if things are going the best they possibly can be, I have this discussion with myself. But our clients usually come in because that discussion has been halted, and instead of, let's say, saying, well, you know, I have this drive, and then I mediate it. That doesn't sound like therapy. That sounds like normal life, right? That's, I have this attitude towards myself. And then I felt very guilty, but I said to myself, well, the main thing is that you go forward, and so for that's a healthy conversation. That's where our clients are stuck. Those conversations are what we call unconscious. In other words, they're settled without picking up any of the pieces separately. Instead, they're settled by a balance between things, so that the inner world is balanced, so I can feel comfortable. So if we take little Hans now, who was attracted to his mother and seemed to be competitive with his father and was afraid of horses, if he knew that he was attracted to his mother, if he knew that he was afraid of his father, he wouldn't have to be afraid of horses, right? The whole idea of therapy is that you take something that you don't have a handle on, and you get a handle on it, and then it becomes boring. Boring, like regular life, you know. Oh, I have this, and oh, I have that. What's exciting is little Hans has this fear of horses, and it's a great mystery. It's a mystery to him, it's a mystery to his parents who love him and try to understand him. It's a mystery at the beginning even to the professor, and it's an exciting mystery. Symptoms are exciting. And one of the things that you have to realize is that sometimes symptoms service us better than resolving the symptoms. They do something for us, which is they create a balance inside. So, for example, when little Hans has a feeling of attraction to his mother, but he can't accept that. He can't say, he's a little kid, he's 4 years old. He doesn't know quite what to do with it. And on the other hand, he needs to balance it with, I can't just go in and throw Dad out of the bedroom and take his place. I can't do that, so I have to make a balance. Now, if he knew the two parts that were being balanced, he wouldn't have trouble, but he doesn't know it. So the unconscious makes a deal. That's what this map is about. The way that the unconscious balances things together, right? And then he's balanced inside, but the outside world is a big mess. He's afraid of horses. How does the fear of horses balance his attraction to his mother and his attitude towards that? Well, when he's afraid of horses, his mother pets him a lot. His mother coaxes with him. That's the translation that they use in England. His mother says, oh, you have this fear of horses, come, and I'll bring you closer. And as a matter of fact, why don't you come into bed with me? And Hans is going to mother's bed. But not because he's attracted to her. But because he has a symptom. So you see, the symptom is solving something. It's creating an inner balance between my attraction and my non-attraction. And if we look at Hans's budding conscience, and we say, well, wait a minute, you're not supposed to do that. This is something that isn't right. So Hans, as a 4-year-old, would think, well, if I'm doing something wrong, there's a big punishment. And little kids generally think that big punishments are maximal punishment, something physical, you've heard of castration, or something like death, or some serious physical punishment. Now, how is this symptom balancing his need for punishment? And the answer is, he's sick. He's sick, he's suffering. So he has an illness. He's afraid of horses, he's not going out of the house. So Hans has managed to find a way to both be guilty and not guilty. Hans has found a way, by being afraid of horses, where he both gets the attraction to his mother and limits the attraction to his mother. It's not me, it's the illness. He punishes himself for having the attraction for his mother, but not maximally. He's only sick. He's not, it's not going to get worse than just as the movies. Because as good as it gets, the best balance will be, okay, I won't go out and I'll be afraid of horses. That's better than having your head chopped up or some other organ. So there's an inner balance. Okay? Yeah.
How does he at such a young age know that he's not supposed to be attracted to his mother?
Because his father's telling him. That gets us to the issue that we were talking about before, which is where the superego comes from. And in this discourse, we're talking about the part of the superego that comes from what the outside world tells us. Because that's not right. That's not right. You shouldn't be doing that. That also, it had to do with the attraction to his mother. It also had to do with his masturbation, which his mother was telling him, if you don't stop that, I'm going to cut it off. Because this was in 1906, and that's what parents said to each other, to their kids. So it comes from the outside world, right? Stop that, that's not good. And as a matter of fact, if you read the case, if any of you want to, by the way, Freud died in 1939. Why is that important? Because the copyright on what you've written is good for 70 years after you die, which is 2019. So, shortly, all of Freud's writings are going to be all over the internet with no copyright. And then you can read whatever you want. Just hold your breath for a little while, and it's all going to be free. Important piece of information. He's being told this is not good, right? Stop. Father says to mother, get him out of your bed. That's not right. That's not. You shouldn't be doing that. That's, in this case, where it comes from, the age of 4, okay? But he's not being punished maximally. He's just afraid of horses, right? Now, so far we have a 2-by-2 table, right? In other words, the unconscious is working overtime and creating a masterpiece. Right? That's what the unconscious creates. That's why I say it's exciting in a way. It's a masterpiece. It manages to have the drive and the attitude, the restraint of the drive, and the punishment and the restraint of the punishment, all together. In addition, there's elements of reality because he lives in the home, and in reality, he's being told that to leave your mother alone, but because he has a symptom, he gets to be with his mother. You can see the conflict. You can see the contradiction there. That's how that's how the unconscious works. It takes things that don't go together, and it has a different logic. What is the logic? We'll get to it in a minute. Just one last part of it. You see that it's a masterpiece of 4 pieces, because Freud, after World War I, began to realize that there's something in the human nervous system that pulls towards repetition. There's something about us that pulls towards repetition. He gave it a rather clumsy name, both in German and certainly in English. It's called a repetition compulsion. Anybody know German? It's the same as Yiddish. Wiederholungswahn. Repetition compulsion. You have a pressure to repeat things. Now that was an interesting notion, which Freud had this complex view of the nervous system, because he was trying to be a psychologist when there wasn't any real psychology. He was way ahead of any psychological thinking, but he wasn't a psychologist. He happened to be a genius, so he read the entire psychological literature and said, I'm not convinced. So he starts to push, towards psychology. But he has these insights about, these are all so far psychological insights, because about meanings. What do you feel you want to do? What are you afraid you might do? What punishment? It's all psychological meanings. And then he said, but it's not only that. There's also some somatic aspects. There's something in the nervous system that's in the body that pulls for repetition. The idea, it's worth mentioning for a moment here, the idea came from what was called then shell shock, what we call post-traumatic stress disorder now. And Freud said all these guys who were coming back from the front, he had 4 sons who were on the front in World War I. All these guys coming back from the front, they can't forget the horrible experiences they had in the trenches. World War I was a new kind of war for 2 reasons. The first reason was that it was the first time that the machine gun was active, and 80% of the casualties were with machine guns. And that meant that you sat in trenches and lobbed mortars on each other and shot at each other. It was very impersonal. It wasn't like getting on a horse with a sword and, as we say in the Israeli army, going after the enemy. You weren't going after anybody. You're sitting in a trench getting shelled all the time. So there's a passivity that tends to pull towards post-trauma. That was true of our soldiers in Tzukaitan in the last round in Gaza, that they were being trapped. It was true of Lebanon too also, that by being trapped, they couldn't look for, they wouldn't be on the aggression, they were on the defensive. That pulls from post-trauma. The other thing is that World War I was the first war that was fought in the world probably where people did not have access to marijuana. Just a side comment. People went to war, they had to drug themselves. If any of you know about the Vietnam War, like 90% of people came back addicted to drugs. And, people would get totally drunk, but there was always marijuana. It was a sort of little secret. And marijuana happens to protect from post-trauma, but the Western world just before World War I said that marijuana is a dangerous drug. That's obviously changing these days, but World War I was that drug. So Freud saw all these people and said, why don't they forget it? I have a pleasure principle. I have a pleasure principle. I've been thinking about this for 40 years. Freud said he was 60. And according to the pleasure principle, these guys should forget what happened to them, but they don't. It keeps coming back. So I think there's another principle. So he wrote a book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which he said the nervous system of human beings tends to repetition. It pulls to repetition. And when things run around in circles, guess what? You can't create meanings. The way you create meanings is when you take A and put it together with B and create something new. If A just repeats itself and repeats itself and repeats itself, it's interrupting the process of making meanings. And that is an instinct, Freud said. That's how we are. And if you look at the Prozac generation, one gets the impression, Freud actually said, maybe there'll be a drug someday that will help this repetition, because psychoanalysis doesn't do it. You just spin around psychoanalysis. Same thing. It doesn't do the trick. So there's a tendency to repetition, and there's a reaction to repetition. Every symptom repeats itself. All of you who have had therapeutic contact with people know that one of the difficulties we have with people is they keep repeating it. But we did that already. Let's move on. Right? In other words, let's put wheels under it and get it moving. And the person just keeps repeating and repeating because they're stuck in sort of a carousel. So Hans continuously is dealing with his fear of horses, and it doesn't seem to go anywhere. He has it again, his father says this, the professor says that, it doesn't seem to go anywhere. But what's going around all the time is only the symptom of the horses, not everything else. Right? So this is a constriction that it's not everything that's going around in his mind, just one little symptom. So look at this masterpiece that our unconscious is able to create, and you will respect your patient's symptoms, right? That they come in with a masterpiece, but they're not the master of the masterpiece. It created itself by itself. Why did it do it? Because it creates an absolutely marvelous inner balance. Look at all the things that are balanced. 4 by 2 in Velder's map. You could do probably a few more things in there, but we'll stay with Velder's map. Everything is balanced. What is not balanced? The outside world. The outside world, Hans is sick. He can't function, and so he comes for help, right? So the way a symptom works is a symptom comes, the person comes with a symptom, they're quite ambivalent. They don't want to let go of the symptom because they're going to lose the inner balance. On the other hand, they have to lose the symptom because otherwise they can't live. And so that ambivalence comes to us. And so it's no surprise that our clients both want and don't want to change. They want to change, but they don't think they can do better than this masterpiece that has offered itself. Now, if you look at this map a little bit more closely, you'll see that when Freud talked about, or when Velder talked about reality, we can look at it a little different. Because Hans is living in a family. And Freud did us a favor with little Hans. He did this treatment in 1906, and he wrote it up in 1908. And he met little Hans in 1920, 12 years later. He was an 18-year-old boy, and Freud wrote a postscript. He said, I met little Hans, and he's no longer little, and I want to tell you how successful the therapy was. It was so successful that Hans is still a strapping young man functioning in the world, even though he had to go through what's most difficult for any child, which is that his parents divorced. So, as family therapists, we say, wait a minute here, that sounds interesting. His parents were on the way to divorce during this whole treatment, and Freud naturally blew it, because Freud didn't see that. It's thanks to Freud that we can see it now, but he didn't see it. And so Freud's view of the family was that the family is doing everything right, and all you need is psychoanalysis. But if we look a little more closely at Hans's family, we see that there's a serious conflict between the two parents. They are seeing things completely differently. The father is telling Hans, grow up, be a boy, leave your mother alone. The mother is telling the boy, come into my bed. I'm apparently sort of lonely. And Hans is in the middle of a family symptom, right? So we would say, okay, Freud didn't see the family. As a matter of fact, Freud wrote once about the family, one sentence about his client's family. He said, I don't know what to do with their families. Haven't got a clue. That was very honest. He really didn't have a clue. If we look at the clue and we say, wait a minute, instead of trying to psychoanalyze Hans, this meaning here, the results of the phobia in the family, right? That he gets to be close with the mother and express his sexual drives, and she's coaxing him, maybe he's coaxing her. Something closeness with this boy is probably a sign of not such closeness with the husband, with the father. And the father also is giving Hans an awful lot of attention, but he's telling Hans, you know, it's your mother's fault. If she would stop bringing you into bed, this would stop. And so we have a marvelous triangle in the professor. The professor had treated Hans's mother once before. The professor was teaching Hans's father, and he became part of the problem and not part of the solution. So Hans was able to overcome his phobia, and when the symptoms stopped servicing the marriage in a triangle, his parents divorced. So that's a certain kind of success in treatment. Do you understand the difference here? In other words, there's if you look at it purely from the inside, you can see this balance. If you look at the part of external reality and say, wait a minute, we know something about families, we could say, this phobia is trying to save the marriage. This phobia is holding together different parts of the marriage, and when the phobia is gone, the parents are going to divorce. And that's apparently what happened. Now, I hope you would be asking yourselves, wait a minute.
The opposite, maybe.
What's that?
Maybe it's the opposite, maybe because the parents divorced, the phobia left.
Because the parents
You
divorced?
said that the phobia kept the marriage together, maybe
Right.
because the parents divorced, he couldn't let go of the phobia.
No, the phobia was over before the parents divorced.
Oh.
Freud didn't know that. It's also, you could ask though, wait a minute, he was intimately involved with these two people. Where did they disappear? How come I didn't know that they divorced until Hans told him 12 years later? It's a good question to ask about the little crowd of Jews hanging around Vienna doing psychoanalysis, but we don't know the answer. But you may have asked yourselves, wait a minute, you're talking about two different kinds of meanings, right? We're talking about inner meanings, right? I'm attracted to my mother, I'm afraid of being attracted to my mother, I'm afraid of my father, I feel guilty. Those are inner meanings. And we're talking about the outside world, which is what the meaning has, what the sophobia does in the outside world. So it would be useful if we would say there are two different kinds of meanings. They're both important meanings. Therapists meet both kinds of meanings all the time, but they're different kinds of meanings, and a therapist will make a choice, minute by minute, what kind of meaning we're dealing with, but we don't want to get confused between the two kinds of meanings. The first kind of meaning is a subjective meaning. A subjective meaning is something that you can look at by talking to your patient about how they feel, about their dreams, about their associations. A lot of it will be indirect communication. Indirect communication. This association suggests that. There's a hint of that. That may be the subjective meaning. Now, what Hans's phobia did or expressed in the couple, that we could call a pragmatic meaning. Pragmatic in the sense that it has to do with results. You can't ask for motivations for pragmatic meanings. Pragmatic meanings, you look at the results. You see what it does. You observe it. And in family therapy, you'll see that we open the screen, we have a mirror, we look at the family, and we see Hans does this and Hans does that. What are the results of what he's doing? What are the results of he says, I'm afraid of horses. What happens after it? So, subjective meanings are, precede the symptom. Subjective meanings are, if you want, the causes. They're the things that create a symptom. The pragmatic meanings are the things that follow. They become what the symptom is doing in the family. So we don't want to get confused. We don't want to say to the parents, what are you trying to do to your parents? He said, what are you talking about? I'm not trying to do anything to my parents. And that's true. He's not trying. It's not conscious. Whereas if you say, when you think about horses that you're afraid of, what do you think of? And he says, oh, the horse has this, bridle, it's like a mustache, and that reminds him of his father's mustache. Okay. That has to do with the subjective meanings, not the pragmatic meanings. But we don't want to confuse them. We will spend the next 3 years figuring out how not to confuse subjective and pragmatic meanings, because psychology is based on subjective meanings, and family work has to look also at the pragmatic meanings. So we're always going back and forth and trying not to get confused. If that line was good, we're good to go. So far, so good? Okay? So, yeah.
Can you give an example of pragmatic again?
Pragmatic is the results of the, let's say we have a symptom. What happens after you have the symptom? Not what came before it. What does it do? It does this to the marriages. Do you say, well, that's what he wanted to do? We don't know.
Okay.
We don't know. We know that his father's mustache and the bridle of the horses remind him, so that's a subjective meaning. How would he know in advance, you could say, that this is going to be the result in the family? And the answer is, of course you don't know in advance, but you know pretty fast, right? In other words, you get to see it after a couple of minutes. You can see that, when you're afraid of horses, this happens to dad, this happens to mom. And the tension between mom and dad seems to get mediated by thinking about, instead of thinking about mom and dad, they're thinking about taking care of Hans and his fear of horses. So the tension in the home seems to be better when I'm afraid of horses. That you can see. Would you know that in advance? No. Would you know it after about 10 seconds? Probably. So they work together. Yeah.
So is that a systems approach?
I can't hear that.
Is that a systems approach?
Okay, so
Not Freudian.
when we talk about, the question is that what we call systems? Well, we'll be talking the whole year about what we call systems. Everybody has a different meaning of systems, but if you want to, that's the first level of it, that you're looking at pragmatic meanings. Now, you would ask yourself, though, so if we see a pragmatic meaning, does that mean that there's no subjective meaning? Why on earth would anybody say something like that? Or if we can find subjective meanings, like Freud did with little Hans, does that mean that there are no pragmatic meanings? Why would anybody say something like that? The answer is that everybody says that because of politics. In other words, the people who are good at subjective meanings are bad at pragmatic meanings. The people who are good at pragmatic meanings, you'll meet one in a minute, Haley, were very bad at subjective meanings. But you folks are going to be good at both of them. Because that's our mission here, is to be able to live in both sets of worlds, to be able to talk with a person about his subject and to see what they're doing in the family and to figure out where we want to put the wheels. That's not an easy task, but that's the task at hand. Now, the dynamics are such that subjective meanings are repressed. Hans not only doesn't know that he's being attracted to his mother, he can't afford to know. He can't afford that. He can't allow himself to feel that. So it's repressed. Repression is something that you do under energy. When something is repressed, it doesn't just go away when somebody says, "Oh, maybe you're attracted to your mother," and little Hans says, "Oh, well, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought of that. Okay." That's not how repression works. That's not how the unconscious works. It's under energy. And when you say, perhaps you had this feeling, the answer is no. In Israel, it's mapitom. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. That's the voice of the repression, right? And then over time, so when you make an interpretation and somebody says, no, but, with some energy, so you know that you're on the right way. Right? I don't think that's right. It's probably, not right. But, that couldn't be. Well, okay. We'll take some time here. It's under energy. Pragmatic meanings are not repressed. It's not like this is what's going on in the family and Hans has to repress it. He doesn't know it. It's a different kind of, you could call it pre-conscious, or just think to yourself about what it's like to be in a group. You've all been in groups. In social work school, you have to go through groups. When you're sitting in a group of, let's say, 4 or 5 people, you don't have a clue what's going on in the group. You have little hints here and there. You can see some of the dynamics. What percentage of the dynamics of a group can you become conscious of? 10, maybe 15 if you're really good. Most of it is spinning around and you can't catch it. It's too fast. That's true of families too. In other words, the pragmatic meanings are not suppressed, but they're not known. And so when we talk to people about pragmatic meanings, a lot of times they will say, gee, I hadn't thought of that. I never looked at it that way. About a pragmatic meaning, we're putting wheels under something. They're trying to see something you hadn't seen before. If they say that about a subjective meaning, it's another story. Right? The epistemology of subjective meanings is linear. That's a sentence which I will be happy to unpack into normal English. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. Episteme is knowledge, and epistemology is how do we know? You say, well, this is this. How do you know that? That's epistemology. The way that we get the subjective meanings is linear. In other words, we say, this caused that. Right? Hans was attracted to his mother, and he couldn't accept that, and that caused him blah, blah, blah. It's linear. This A causes B. Pragmatic meanings are never linear. They're circular. What does that mean? That Hans is afraid of horses. And then, right? Not what came before, but and then. And then his mother brings him into bed. And then his father says, why you bring him into bed? And then Hans gets even more afraid of horses. See the circle? Right? So pragmatic things run around in a group. Things in a group always run in circles. They're never linear. And that is a big problem for therapists who would like to say, you have this fear of horses because you want to be, because you're saving your parents' marriage. The word because is out of line. We don't have linear epistemology. We can't say we know something linearly, but we can say, well, look at that. Every time you get afraid of horses, your parents stop fighting between themselves about the bed and fight about you in the bed. How about that? Right? So that's the way you talk about a pragmatic meaning. But to say it's because of something You can't, we don't have linear epistemology in pragmatic meanings. It's very frustrating. I can see in your face, that it's frustrating, right? But, wait a minute. But I want to explain to them how this happened. Forget it. Pragmatic meanings, you don't explain how something happened. You talk about how it works, and then people say, I don't want to do that anymore, right? You can think to yourself about the rest of the Velter's chart, and you can imagine this was because of this and this because of that, but it's not useful for the therapy. Those aren't the wheels you're putting under it. You want to put the wheels under your attraction to your mother, see the kid individually. If you want to put your wheels under the family is running through the symptom and the kid is saving the marriage, don't talk about the subjective meanings, talk about the pragmatic meanings, how it's working. Yeah.
I'm just curious, like mapping out the circular map with the family.
Right.
As in if you could talk about it, because these things are things you could actually see.
Right.
So if you could map it out like on a whiteboard and the family could see what's actually happening, is that a way to like break the cycle?
So the question is, that's a circle, right? The question is, actually the question is, what on earth are you talking about? But I'll say it in the more polite way that you put it, which is, wait a minute, so then you can write it out on a whiteboard and show the family that that's how it's working. Clinically? No. See, but it's a very good question, because how we think as therapists and what we do as therapists are not the same. That's one of the things that Freud had a great deal of trouble learning. He thought that if you had this, he called it an Einfall, right? You had this Einfall that you knew that this is the stroke of genius, that this is, I can see, what's causing this. That all you have to do is tell the boy. That's what he did to little Hans. And because that's how Freud thinks, then Hans will think the same way. It didn't work, right? And it's the same with families. We can start to see the circles, but to tell the family, this is your circle, that's not how to do it. How to do it, we'll get to. But you see, your fantasy is a very useful one, which is once you see a pragmatic meaning, all you need to do is make it conscious. The way that it got conscious to me. I write things in my brain in the whiteboard, right? So I'm going to show you on the way, this is how it works, and then they'll stop doing it. Unfortunately, that is never the case. What is the case, we'll get to. It's a different kind of communication, but it's a very useful question that you asked. Yeah, another useful question. What's yours?
Does it ever switch, like say Hans is attracted to the father and the mother is the, the bad person?
Right. The question is, do little boys get attracted to their fathers? And the answer is, of course. Freud used the term negative Oedipus complex. He meant negative the way we talk about the negative of photograph. He's not talking about positive and negative value. It's the photo. Everybody in that period referred to negative in the sense of the negative photograph. It's the inverse, right? So sure. And sometimes that's where you get stuck as well. And Hans had a little of each, because he's a human being, and human beings have a little of everything.
Can you explain again with Hans' symptom, the difference between linear and circular?
In Hans' symptom, what's the difference between linear and circular in Hans' symptom? Linear in Hans' system is before he had the symptom, he was attracted to his mother and was afraid of it and was feeling guilty and was afraid of that, and he needed to make a compromise, and that's what caused the symptom. The symptom was an unconscious combination of all of these, the unconscious masterpiece. Those feelings caused the symptom. The circular part is, we say, when Hans says, I'm afraid of horses, doesn't matter why. He says, I'm afraid of horses, what then happens in the family? Mother brings him into bed, father says, don't do that. That's circular. And then after that's gone on, Hans says, I'm even more afraid of horses, right? So, okay? It's good that you asked.
I don't understand.
Sorry, what?
I still don't understand the difference.
The difference between linear and circular. Let's take one more question, and we're not going to leave until you do. Don't worry. And the other thing is, you're doing everybody a favor, because he's not the only one that doesn't quite get it yet. It's going to take us a year, but slowly, step by step. Yeah, Moshe.
Is that a pragmatic calculation or a subjective calculation?
Which?
That if he's not the only one.
Was that pragmatic? It was, but that wasn't your question.
That was my question.
Okay. You just give us it. The answer is, in pedagogy, you can make a mess. It's the privilege of the teacher. Yeah.
My question was, Does the pragmatic style believe that there is a subjective meaning in the client, we just don't know it,
Right.
and we're not showing it to the client?
So what do people who do pragmatic therapy believe? So that's why I had you read Jay Haley, right? Does Jay Haley believe that it's interesting to know what in his little Hans' soul brought him to be afraid of dogs? No. He says, forget it. It's of no importance whatsoever. There was only pragmatic meaning. That's why I gave you the article. Family therapy started, we'll put it in very broad terms, mostly with people who failed in their own psychoanalysis. They had an axe to grind. There's a lot of politics there. And when people started to do family therapy, they said, I can see this, and that's the only truth, right? And the truth is, everybody who makes a discovery first thinks that way. You know, the guys in the yeshiva know that, you know, when you have a svara, you're sure that it's right, and then you start to see the other sides of it. But if you're not excited about it, how can you think it at all, right? So people make a new discovery, they have a new way of thinking, and they're sure that it's true. If you live a long time, you get to change your mind. So Haley's articles from the 1970s. Family therapy then was very young and very combative. Family therapy was very combative, that if there is a pragmatic meaning, there is no subjective meaning. Now that's, you know, not news to you, because these days when people say, well, if there's a cognitive meaning, then there's no emotional meaning. To say that, that's how things develop, but not here. You know, we're not in a laboratory where we're trying to fight, you know, the good fight about what's true. Because as I said before, a good therapist says, a big handle on the truth is beyond us. We don't have a handle on the whole truth. What we have is a handle on what's stuck and what wheels we could put under it. And if the wheel works, use it. And will you know all of it? No. So sometimes you'll settle for a pragmatic treatment and say, I don't know anything about the subjective meanings. I wish I did. But if I don't know about them, does that mean they don't exist? Well, just think of it. That's rubbish, right? That doesn't make any sense. Does it happen in the world? Oh, it happens all the time. That's what's called politics. In other words, that you have to defend what you know against other things. But I think most people, if you think for a moment, you say, if you know something that's true, it doesn't need defense, and it doesn't obliviate other truths, it just lives with them, right? The world is complicated enough. So we're going to try to live with all of them. I'm just going to peek at the clock. There we go. Now, pragmatic, and let's go through a little bit more of the chart and see if we can get that. I'll take a question in just a minute, okay? Let's just see if we complete it, it makes it easier. The function of subjective meaning is equilibrium, but it's inner equilibrium, right? The function of pragmatic meaning is equilibrium, but it's external equilibrium. The function of Hans being afraid of horses was to keep him from knowing all the other stuff that he didn't want to know. The function of Hans in the family was to equilibrate the family with the symptom. The symptom disappeared, apparently they divorced, right? So symptoms, people come with difficulties, they don't want to let them go, because it's like saying, wait a minute, I'm going to hop on one foot. How's that going to help me? I'm going to be out of balance. People who come to us are extraordinarily courageous, because they come and they say, I'm willing to accept a loss of equilibrium. I'm willing to take this masterpiece, a pragmatic masterpiece or a subjective masterpiece, or, according to your question, both, always, right? I'm going to take this masterpiece and I'm going to let it go in favor of something that I'm afraid to know about, or something that we're afraid to be able to live with. But they do it because they know the equilibrium is not only balanced, but it's not alive. It's not moving. It's not growing. And so they say, okay, we're going to take a risk. So one of the things that's most important when you see somebody walk into the room is to say, how did they have the courage to walk into the room? I'm the most dangerous person on the planet to them. And they're taking it upon themselves. So it gives us a certain amount of humility when they say, look, you're not helping me. I say, well, okay, that's part of the deal, right? That you can't let go of it. So you're holding on to something that you need, we have to find something else to put wheels under. Maybe I'm doing pragmatic, I should do subjective, maybe I'm doing something that isn't useful. Change is always this equilibrium. That's the other side of what I just said. That people come and say, I want to change. Well, as you know, from the days of Freud, people said when somebody says, I want to change, they're saying, I want to change, and I am terribly frightened of change. No one comes in and just says, I want to change. If you say they want to change, so change. No, what's stopping you from changing? What's stopping you from changing is yourself. You're afraid of it. So this equilibrium is going to happen in the family, right? If you pull out the symptom from the family, you need to think about what is this family made out of if you take the symptom out of the equilibrium. And if a person says, I want to change myself, you have to think, how is he going to put the pieces together? And before he puts the pieces together, he's going to be in pain. People come in order to invite us to give them pain. This equilibrium is painful. One of the great psychotherapists of the Western world was Harry Stack Sullivan, who was a Grace Meshuggah, but a genius. And some Anglo-Saxons still have heard of Sullivan. In Israel, he's totally missing. He's a big player in America. Sullivan always used to say, if a therapist says that it's fun, he's not doing therapy. It's not fun. It's interesting. It gets us all sorts of good things, but it's not fun, because it's not fun for the client. So the last is that the interpretation, you see, of what do we do when we intervene in a subjective meaning? We intervene by giving an interpretation. We say, the horse's bridle is your father's mustache. The horse falling down is something that has to do with having a bowel movement. In other words, make interpretations, and people resist it, and then they come to terms with it. That works okay for you? But in pragmatics, we don't make an interpretation. We don't say this means that. Sort of like your question about do we put it on the whiteboard and say this is what it means. We don't do that. We change the meaning. We make it possible for the meaning to become different. About that, we'll be talking much later. Now, let's go back to what you said about
Do subjective and pragmatic meanings come together, which means that Hans's desire for his mother and his need to keep the family intact, are those just two things that happen to work out nicely together, that he was able to take care of both of the things that he was looking for? Or there's something deeper?
Yeah, you got it. You got it. And the question was, well, wait a second. There's the subject and the meanings that come together. When Hans has this symptom of being afraid of horses, is he creating both a subjective equilibrium and a pragmatic equilibrium? And the answer is that's exactly what happened. You see, in the map, we had Velder saying there's the ego, and there's the drives in the ego, the superego, and the superego in the ego, the repetition compulsion in the ego, and external reality. Velder didn't go into external reality because he didn't know about families. As soon as you unpack the external reality, you see that that's part of the map. It's right there. It's in Freud's map, right? The external reality. So do they go together? Not only do they go together very well. In other words, if a symptom is stable, equilibrium, it's probably creating equilibrium inside and outside, between people and inside the person. And that's why it's your best friend and your worst enemy, because it's much smarter than you are. So there's nobody here who can consciously create a symptom. Symptoms are brilliant. They do make balances that you can't do consciously. That's what the unconscious is for. But they also are unrealistic, right? And they cause pain, and they keep people from moving. Equilibrium keeps people from moving, and the world goes ahead. But are they always there together? They're always there together. And that makes us back to Moshe's question. So if they're always there together, why would anybody say that they're either one or the other? And the answer is, if you don't say that, I'm happy. The fact that other people say it, so they say it. Yeah.
So the way I'm understanding it is that the pragmatic is always external and the subjective is inner. So
that's right.
You have them together.
That's right. People live in the question is, pragmatic is external and subjective is internal. Exactly. The equilibrium that's created And by the subjective meanings is internal, and the equilibrium that's created by the pragmatic means is external. And since all of us live internally and externally, so we can't cut the world and divide it, but it's very complicated to look at one and then the other, and one and then the other. And if you want to take Moshe's question more seriously, so it's hard to do. Put it this way, if you're creating a new field, it's hard to, you're confused if you do things that are too far afield. If Freud had said to himself, which he really did, but let's say he said, look, Ziggy, this is, his mother called him Ziggy. Meine goldene Ziggy, that was his mother. If he said to himself, look, I live in a family, I'm raising a big family. I started psychoanalysis when my father died. What is I'm not saying about families? Families is all over the place here. And the answer would be, I can't do that. I'm busy. I'm trying to see one thing and the other thing bothers, it confuses me. So I'm simply, what physicists say, I'm simply dealing with a simple system. I can't deal with all of reality, I'm dealing with a simple system. And he also said, because that's how we do research. You have to limit your field. And when family therapists began, that's what they were doing. They were creating a different kind of simple system, ignoring internal meanings because they were very bad at it. If you read Haley, you'll see he's very bad at working with internal meanings. So he worked on external meanings and created something new. But here, this is Yeshiva Shamata. Nobody's creating anything new here, right? We're trying to learn how to talk to people. And so you want to take from these creations and know how to use them. And it's not so simple. Yeah.
We're trying to work with epistemology as linear and circular, sort of both of them being true.
Right.
In the linear epistemology, we need to get to the cause.
Right.
We're assuming there's
Linear
a cause.
epistemology is the cause.
But when we're thinking pragmatically and we're intervening at any point, that means we're not really addressing the cause. And we should be expecting some sort of symptom to take its place after.
Right, so I'll just exaggerate your question and say, whoa, I can understand if you can get to the cause of something and treat it. If you get, what?
What was the question?
I'm exaggerating the question. The question is, if you can get to the cause of something, so that speaks to me. That's real science, and things will, because I got at the cause of it. But if you're just dealing with how it runs around in the family, that would be superficial. And what about the cause? What, do you think nothing's going to, how does that make any sense to deal with the circular epistemology of pragmatics? It's an excellent question, and the answer is twofold. One part of the answer is that when Hans is relieved, let's say we do family therapy, he comes to the family institute, says, I'm afraid of horses. We say, Hans, you're in the wrong century. This is the first I said, no, I'm still afraid of horses. All right. So there was some kid who was afraid of horses. Let's do horses. And we say, well, when you say that you're afraid of horses, what does your mother do? What does your father do? And then, okay. And then he says, I'm not afraid of horses anymore. And then we talk to the parents, and they say, we realize we'll be using them. Our trouble has to do with, not with Hans, but with something in the bed. Okay. So then your question is, how does that help the internal meanings? How does that change the cause of it? He's not going to change because the family changes. And the answer to that, which was already alluded to, is that they go together. In other words, when you create a subjective symptom, it's within a certain pragmatic context, right? In other words, when Hans says, I can't want my mother, it's dangerous. That's not just inside. It's within the family context. Oedipus is a family dynamic. It has to do with Oedipus and his father, right? And a few other players, if you like to read the original drama. It wasn't just an internal thing, right? So if Hans is now relieved of it, can he solve his own subjective problems himself? Freud would say, probably, because people, I'll tell you in a somewhat different way that'll make it a little easier. People come in with internal subjective symptoms that they created when they were small, because when they were small, they were both small, right, and alone. The way that you get to a subjective or a neurotic symptom is you have to be both alone and small. So Hans had nobody to talk to, right, about what he was feeling, because his parents were busy tension with each other. And he was small, so that was the only way he could think about it. So being alone and small, that's how you create a symptom. So if you're no longer small and not alone, or one or the other, then you can say, wait a minute, why do I have to think that way? In other words, I don't need this internal balance now, because the external balance gives me room to talk to my father about how he feels, to talk with my mother about how she feels and how I feel, and I start to see. And then that relieves the tension, and I don't need the inner equilibrium to be solved by the unconscious. So now you can say, because you look a little skeptical, well, has anybody proven that? And the answer is politics. People don't look. But you will see it, and that's the second part of the question. See, you will start with families when you say to them, we're going to get to this a lot later, but you say to them, look, what is it that makes you feel this way? And they say, if I wanted psychoanalysis, I wouldn't have come to you. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about how to change it. So they say, so I'm going to do pragmatics, right? So you start to do the pragmatics, and then you say to yourself, what I would suggest is, once the pragmatics changes, now it's possible to do the subjective. Now it's possible to change the form of therapy and be able to address the inner balance, because I need to or because it's just important to do, you know, to air things out. And that's what a lot of your clients will end up teaching you, because that's who teaches you. This is just the Vorspeis. They will teach you that once the family is not running in circles, symptomatic circles, then you do a different kind of therapy. Then you talk about how you're feeling. You couldn't have done it before, but now you can. And so there's no reason to say we're doing only pragmatic therapy. If you read Haley's article, you see that's what he said. He said, little Hans stopped being afraid of his of dogs, and so he said, hey, the world is solved, and there are no subjective meanings. Is that a reasonable thing to say? No, it's not. And some of Haley's patients come back 5 years later because the subjective parts were not aired out. But that means that we take upon ourselves a rather complex mission. It's not only synchronic, but is both subjective and pragmatic all the time, and we have to make a choice. There's also diachronic. Diachronic means over time, right? That we say to ourselves, where do we put the wheels now? Where are the wheels taking us? And what wheels are now available later on that they weren't available before? So that's how a therapist thinks about time, not about relieving the symptom. Haley was purely about relieving the symptom, right? But he wasn't thinking about the overall growth of his little boy. He wasn't thinking about the impact of this treatment. He wasn't thinking about how the kid is doing other than the symptom. He thought that therapy is relieving symptoms. And he was good at that with a certain population. But your questions are a little broader, which is, does it have to be that way? And the answer is, of course it doesn't have to be that way. Right? It just is that way if that's all you see, but there's no reason to limit how you see your clients. So we are now going to do an exercise. It's not exactly on this chart, but it's related to the chart. And I'll tell you what the exercise is, and then the men will come with me, and the women will find a way to make this space work.
The women are going out of the...
Also? Out to another room?
Right,
Good.
the men were going to stay here.
So I'm saying, especially in high school, but afterwards. And when he would lay, this is at Maimonides in Boston, and he was always very proud that the guy always had him laying on Holomoid Sukkos. Always Holomoid Sukkos. And so he was sure that Rabbi Soloveitchik, who used to come to the minyan, was like his laying. And he lived with this for 20 years. This was subjective meaning, that the Rav loves my laying. Sitting next to me in shul in Israel was the Gabbai, who used to have this guy laying. So he says, I think you know this guy, I'm going to tell you a story. He lanes, in the Cholomoid Sukkos, so you Ha'ilim v'Hakvasim. So it's a chazer and a tavir, Ha'ilim v'Hakvasim. And this guy used to lane the following way, Ha'ilim v'Hakvasim. And Rabbi Soloveitchik used to crack up. You see, and so these were sad years in his life, and they wanted to make him crack up. So the reason that the guy was laying in Holomoid Sukkos subjectively was because he's a fine laner. Pragmatically was to get Rav Soloveitchik to laugh.
Okay, so that's a simple example. So let's hear what you think you've learned and where the questions stand now. What would you folks want to say at this point? If you don't talk, I'm going to talk. I've already talked enough. Yes?
We talked a little bit about creating the movement rather than saying this is what I think it means for you. So we're
Right.
asking more questions and that sort of thing, and I found that very effective.
Okay. In other words, it lightens it up a little bit. You
Yeah.
don't have to have answers. But actually, therapy is about a continuous discussion. In our group, one of the men said, I realized that if I'm thinking something and the person says it before I tell him that, that's even better. And that's an insight of Winnicott. That the best interpretation is the interpretation that while you're thinking it, your client can tell you that, right? That means you're thinking together. You're not racing him to give the interpretation, but if you're thinking along the same lines and he says, maybe that had to do with my parents' relationship. Voila. So you were thinking it and he said it. So you just say, that's an interesting thought. Let's go on. So the wheels get moving. What else? I'm trying to do it wrong. You have an exercise that you can do. I've actually done it for you, which is to take Haley's purely pragmatic case and translate it into Velder's map. Did you read Haley's case? The so-called modern little hands, a boy who's afraid of dogs, right? So there you have somebody who only wants to talk about the results. That this got the problem for Hans was that his mother was too close to him, his father was too far from him, his father was a mailman, and Hans was afraid of dogs. But his fear of dogs brought him pragmatically too close to mother, and the father said, who needs a pitcher who's afraid of dogs? So the symptom expressed what was the matter in the system. And so what did Haley do? He had his little Hans go on the mail route with the father, right? And so the father taught him how not to be afraid of dogs, because in America in those days, there was a dog that was going to bite you, and then he had to get to the front door to deliver the mail. So mailmen were good with dogs. So he taught the boy how to be good with dogs. That made the boy closer to his father. And he told the mother, let the father do this, and you just butt out for a little while. So he gave the boy more space from his mother. And he told the parents, when you finish the treatment, the two of you go to the hotel and celebrate the fact that you finished this treatment. So he treated 3 parts of a triangle. We'll talk about that more in detail much later. And so the pragmatic meanings went away, and Hans, this little boy, was no longer afraid of dogs. What I leave to you to do is to take that and fill this in. I kind of sketched it for you, but in your spare time, if you can fill it in and see how the pragmatic and the subjective meanings fit all together into one whole, then you will have completed this lesson. By way of saying, this course is entirely online. You should have gotten an email that told you how to log into the course. The course, we have to thank Javi for what I think is the cutting edge technology. In each lesson, you have the PowerPoint, you have the readings, you should have the video of the lesson up within a few days of after the lesson. So if you were late, you can catch up, and if you missed it, you can catch up. And at the bottom of the page is a place for comments. And this is lesson number 2. At the bottom of lesson number 2 for comments, that is our blog. You put in a comment, you log into the site, and then you see that I put in a comment already welcoming you and saying this is where you put your comments. And so we would like to hear from everyone. To become a learning group, we would like everyone to participate in the blog. The default, if you say to yourself, what's a blog? I don't know what to put in the blog. So the default is something that I think I learned. So for example, your comment, something that I think I learned that was important, because the point of it is to share it with the group. and one question that I was left with. For example, what exactly is pragmatic? Some question like that. So we want to hear from everybody in the group. That makes us read in the week between our lessons what we're thinking together, how well we're doing, what's coming together, what's not yet coming together. And so it's important to hear from everybody. It's also important because in a group, some people like to ask questions in public and some people don't, but everybody can put what they have to say in the blog. You can communicate. Somebody puts up a question, nothing would make me happier than to have one of you say, this is how I thought it was, and then we can see exactly where we're going. So is that friendly enough to everybody? Okay, so this was lesson 2, and the comments under lesson 2, you put in the comment, then there's a black little button that says post it. Post it means that it actually goes in. If you just write it and then you go offline, it's gone. Post it, you have to post it. That's as much as I know about the internet. So we're going to do that. Next week, we are probably going to have a better room. We've had the feeling that it's a little crowded in here, particularly because it's mixed men and women, that it's a little bit too crowded. We found a room that has another 1.5 meters width, and we're going to move to that room next week. So you'll have another yellow brick path to follow for the next week. It's closer to the clinic, and I hope that will solve logistics. Dina, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted just to make mention again, if you haven't submitted the pink form, your therapist tracking session, so you should be reviewing it with your supervisor, and there's a box in the library for you to put it in, and as you walk in, there's a checkoff sheet that you can just mark off that you submitted it. And if you
were left with. This was the most complex of all the lessons we're going to have. It gets easier. Actually, the next one isn't so easy, and then it gets easier. But it will get easier, but this is the foundation. So it's very important that we come all together and have the foundation together. So what's still left unclear?
Under the dynamics, the unconscious and the pre-conscious, can you explain that again?
Right, but that's one way of Freud thinking about it. Dynamics means the energies that pressure each other. The word dynamic, dynamos in the Greek, is the word for power. Here we're talking about something that you can't allow yourself to know. You've invested energy in not knowing it. You're actively not knowing it. That's what's called repression, that you're actively not knowing it. And when something is actively not known, you really don't want to know it. So when somebody tells you, you have to say, get out of here, right? You don't say, oh, that's interesting. You send them off because the energy is still there. Whereas what you don't see, we came to this partly in the exercise, when you don't see what's happening in a group, you don't see the pragmatic meanings, you haven't repressed them, you never knew them. You never knew them. Something that's repressed was known and repressed. It was almost known and repressed, right? But to know what's going on in the room, or going on all in the family dynamics, is something you just haven't noticed because it's a group phenomenon. So it doesn't live as something I know that this is holding my mother and my father together, but I don't want to know it. That would be repressed. In this case, this is. What does it have to do with anything? I just am afraid of horses. What does it have to do with my parents? It just haven't seen it. And when somebody comes to notice something that was not repressed, then they're more easily your partner. In other words, they say, wow, I hadn't noticed that. That's really interesting. I don't know what to do with it, but it's interesting, right? Nobody says that's interesting about something that's repressed. They say it's not, right? Interesting means that it's something that's, and the pragmatic things are generally not suppressed. They haven't put energy into not knowing it. You just haven't known it because it's a group phenomenon. Yeah.
I think I missed the last piece, the intervention piece, the interpretation versus change meaning. Can you explain that again?
I'm afraid I can't hear you well.
The intervention, the last piece, interpretation versus change meaning.
The introduction.
Interpretation versus change meaning was the last.
The repetition.
On the chart, the last thing was
under subjective and pragmatic, the last thing was was intervention.
Oh, intervention. Okay, the question is, what is the intervention? Right. When you're doing interventions in subjective meanings, because they are suppressed, and because it's the causes of the behavior, what you want to do is to essentially interpret. Right? In other words, you don't interpret directly, you come at them indirectly, like we talked last time, there are hints, but the person comes to a new understanding of what made me do that. What, for example, if Hans says, okay, I now understand that I was attracted to my mother, so he has a new understanding that he doesn't now need to create an equilibrium with it because he can handle it, that piece by itself. That's the interpretation. This is what was there that you hadn't seen before. In pragmatic meetings, this is the question about the whiteboard. In pragmatic meetings, we rarely say, look, this is what's going on. What we do is we intervene in how the pragmatics work. We say to somebody, for example, you know, Hans, next week, I'd like you to be afraid of elephants. How about elephants? Now, that's not explaining anything, right? But it might change. We'll get to that sort of intervention when we get to them. But we say, well, that's going to change the pragmatics in the family because there aren't any elephants across the street from his building in Vienna, right? So, but we're not saying, why are you afraid of horses? We're saying, let's change the horses to elephants and see what happens. So it's an intervention in the symptom itself. We'll get to that when we get to strategic and paradoxical interventions, but we don't explain it. They might explain it to us afterwards. We may be thinking it, but we don't intervene by saying this is what it's doing, because usually the people who need the pragmatic interventions, they can't use it. It's not useful for them to understand it. They have an experience of changing it. One last question. Yeah.
You said something that...
Two last questions. Yeah.
You said that when you're looking pragmatically, there's really no suppression.
What? When you're doing?
When you're viewing pragmatically, there's really no repression because you're unaware of it.
No, when you're doing a pragmatic intervention, you're changing something that they're still unaware of. You're changing how it runs, but you're not telling them why it runs. And you're not trying to lift a repression about something they didn't want to know. You're just making it work differently. We'll spend a lot of time with that, but it's not the same as an interpretation. Interpretation is how we can understand the causes. What were the pieces of the puzzle that made you put this together? The intervention is, let's put the puzzle together differently. We're not talking about why. And one last question.
Yeah, is one intervention more effective than the other, or just case by case or style?
So this whole year, which intervention is more effective? This whole year is going to be devoted to trying to answer for which client, which intervention works better. The trouble with the politics is that Haley will claim, this is what to do with all families. It ain't right. That's not true. And Freud would say, well, you have to do psychoanalysis. He didn't say that, but let's say, for everybody, because that's the only real treatment. That's not right. People will come in, and you will be asking yourself, there are subjective meanings, and there are pragmatic meanings. Under which can I put wheels? Where is the therapeutic movement? What role are they giving me? And in that role, which place should I start with? Not necessarily where I finish, but where should I be starting? That we'll be getting to over time. But it's very good that you asked the question, because that's not the question, right? In other words, the question is broader. It's for each client, how do I make a choice? How do I use myself in the way that helps them to start to move? Okay, we're going to stop with that. Further questions, answers, and problems in the blog. Hope to meet you all there. And next time, if you come late, you'll know why.